"Take your hand off me. I don't care who you think you are." The answer was no the first time. She had struck him before she understood what she was doing. The sound of it, a flat, sharp crack against the murmur of the masquerade, seemed to arrive a full second after her palm had already left his cheek, as though the room needed a moment to believe what it had seen. Lyra Venmore stood, with her hand still raised, her breath unsteady behind the silver lace of her half-mask, and looked at the man she had just slapped in the middle of the Callaway winter mask. He did not flinch. That was the thing she would remember later, in the cold hours before dawn, when the memory returned uninvited and warm with shame. The way he had simply absorbed it, the way a stone wall absorbs a thrown pebble, the way deep water absorbs a dropped coin without breaking its surface. His head had turned perhaps 2 inches with the force of it. Then it had turned back, and his eyes, the only part of his face the black domino mask left uncovered, had settled on her with an expression that was not anger and was not amusement and was not, most unsettling of all, surprise. He looked at her as though she had confirmed something he had merely suspected. He had touched her arm. That was the whole of his crime as she had understood it. She had been standing at the edge of the ballroom, near the tall frosted windows, having declined 3 dances and 1 proposal of marriage disguised as a compliment, and a man she did not know, masked, broad-shouldered, dressed in a coat so plainly cut among all that peacock excess that it announced its own arrogance, had stepped into her space and closed his hand around her forearm and said, in a low, unhurried voice that did not bother to rise into a question, "Come with me, not please, not may I, come with me," as if she were a coat he had decided to retrieve, so she had slapped him, and now the nearest dancers had stilled, and a countess by the punch table had pressed her fan to her lips, and the orchestra, blessedly, played on. The man tilted his head a fraction. "You misunderstood," he said quietly. "I doubt it," Lyra said. Her voice did not shake, which she counted as a small private triumph. Men who grab women in the dark have rarely been misunderstood. "There was a man behind you," he said, "with a knife meant for the ribs of Lord Callaway, who is standing 6 feet to your left. I intended to move you out of the path. I did not intend to explain myself first, which was," he conceded, "an error." She did not believe him. Then she looked, despite herself, to her left, where Lord Callaway was indeed laughing at something, entirely unharmed, and to the floor near the windows, where a man in a green mask was being escorted with great firmness toward a side door by 2 members of the household staff she had not noticed arrive. She looked back at the stranger. His cheek had begun to redden where she had struck it. He had not raised a hand to touch it. "You're welcome to keep doubting me," he said. "It costs me nothing." And then he bowed, precise and unhurried, and walked away into the candlelit crowd, leaving Lyra Venmore alone, at the edge of a ballroom, with her hand stinging, and her certainty, for the first time in a long and carefully managed evening, entirely undone. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself this 3 times on the carriage ride home, and did not believe it any of the 3. Lyra Venmore was 24 years old, and had learned a great many things the hard way, and chief among them was the precise value of her own composure, which was to say everything, because it was nearly all she had left. The Venmore name still opened certain doors, but the rooms behind those doors were emptier than the name suggested. Her father had been a kind and clever man who had loved horses he could not afford and trusted men he should not have, and when he had died of a fever 2 winters past, he had left his only daughter a town house with a leaking roof, an estate in the north that was mortgaged past its worth, and a stack of obligations written in his hopeful, ruinous hand. Her mother had died years before that, and so there was no one to manage the disaster but Lyra, who had been managing it ever since with the grim efficiency of a woman bailing water from a boat she refused to admit was sinking. She kept the accounts herself. She let the staff go one by one, with references and small severances she could not spare, until only old Mrs. Hartley the cook and a single maid remained. She attended the season's events, not because she enjoyed them, but because a woman who vanished from society was a woman whose creditors grew bold, and so she appeared, gowned in her mother's altered silks, composed and pleasant and entirely unavailable, declining every suitor who circled her diminished fortune like gulls over a tide line. She had attended the Callaway mask for exactly this reason, and had intended to leave it untouched. Instead, she had slapped a stranger and could not stop thinking about his eyes. The man, she learned over the following 2 days without trying to learn it, had not been a stranger to anyone but her. The Countess with the fan had recognized him through his mask the moment he bowed. The whole of fashionable London, it turned out, had recognized him, which was perhaps why the dancers had stilled so quickly and why no one had come to Lyra's defense, because there had been nothing to defend her from but a man whose displeasure was generally considered a thing to avoid acquiring. He was the Duke of Ashmere. Adrian Thorne, the seventh of that title, was spoken of in the particular hushed register reserved for men who were too powerful to gossip about safely and too interesting to leave alone. He held estates in 4 counties and a seat at the King's Council that he occupied more often than custom required. He had inherited young at 21, when his elder brother had died in circumstances no one discussed above a whisper, and he had spent the decade since turning a faltering dukedom into something formidable which had earned him respect and almost no affection. He did not dance, he did not court. He had, 3 years ago, been engaged to a woman of impeccable family, and the engagement had ended, and the manner of its ending was the one piece of him that London could not quite assemble, because every version of the story disagreed with every other, save on the single point that the lady had married another within the season, and the Duke had not been seen to pursue anyone since. He had a reputation for coldness that people mistook for cruelty, and a reputation for cruelty that was, Lyra would come to understand, mostly the invention of men he had outmaneuvered. She had slapped him in front of the entire ton. She had called him a man who grabbed women in the dark, and she had been, in the matter of the knife at least, entirely and humiliatingly wrong. The summons arrived on the 3rd morning, and it was not what she expected. Lyra had been braced for something, though she could not have said what. A cold note demanding apology, a pointed snub that would ripple through the season's invitations and finish what her father's debts had begun. What came instead was a single sheet of heavy cream paper delivered by a footman in Ashmere livery, whose horse alone was worth more than the contents of her stable, and the message upon it was written in a hand that was controlled, but not the practiced copperplate, of a secretary. This was the Duke's own writing. She understood, which meant he had not delegated it. The note read, "You were wrong about the knife, and right to mistrust a stranger who gives orders in the dark. Both can be true. I find I require an honest opinion on a private matter, and have met very few people willing to strike me for the right reasons. Will you call at Ashmere House on Thursday at 11 A.T.?" She read it twice. Then she sat down at her writing desk, in the cold morning light, with the leaking roof above her and the unpaid coal merchant's bill beneath her elbow, and considered, with the cold clarity she applied to all her surviving choices, what a duke could possibly want with an opinion from a woman who had publicly assaulted him. The cynical answer arrived first, because the cynical answer always arrived first when one was poor and unmarried and being summoned by a powerful man. She dismissed it after a moment, not because she trusted him, but because the note had been wrong for it. A man arranging an indecent proposal did not begin by conceding a point. A man arranging a seduction did not write "You were right to mistrust me." There was something else in the note, something she recognized because she lived inside it herself, a quality of guardedness so habitual it had become a kind of architecture. Whatever the Duke of Ashmere wanted, he had decided to be honest about it, and honesty from a man of his rank was rare enough to be worth 2 hours of her Thursday morning. She wrote back a single line, "I will come at 11, though I make no promise to be agreeable." LV, and on Thursday she went. Ashmere House was not what she expected either, which she was beginning to recognize as a pattern where this man was concerned. She had braced for grandeur deployed as a weapon, the cold, declarative wealth of a man who used his house to make visitors feel small. What she found instead was a house that had clearly been arranged by someone who actually lived in it. The paintings hung at the height a person would choose, if a person meant to look at them rather than merely own them. The books on the library shelves were worn at the spines. There were fresh winter roses on a side table, white and faintly opening, the kind of arrangement that took thought rather than display. She revised 3 assumptions about the Duke of Ashmere between the front door and the study, and she had not yet seen his face. He was standing at the tall window when she entered, his back half turned to the room, one hand at his side, the other holding a glass of water he had not touched. Without the mask, his face was sharper than she had imagined and less severe. The high cheekbones, the dark hair, the grey eyes that were exactly the colour of deep winter water and settled on her now with that same unhurried attention she remembered from the ballroom. The cheek she had struck bore no mark. He had healed in 3 days, but he had not, she suspected, forgotten Lady Venmore, he said. Your Grace, she replied, and did not curtsy lower than courtesy required. He noticed. She saw him notice. The corner of his mouth moved, not into a smile, but toward the place where a smile might begin. You came, he said. You sounded as though you would be insulted if I did not, she said. He gestured to a chair across the small table from his own, and to her quiet surprise he did not sit until she had. And when he poured tea, he poured it himself, which dukes did not generally do, and which she filed away with the roses and the worn books, and the absence of grandeur. I will not waste your morning, he said. I am being robbed. Lyra set down the cup she had just lifted. By whom, she asked. That, he said, is the matter on which I require an honest opinion. His estates, he explained, with a precision that did not exaggerate or perform, had over the past year begun to bleed, in ways that did not appear in any ledger his stewards could find. Rents collected that never reached his accounts, contracts signed in his name that he had not authorized, small sums, then larger ones, vanishing through a structure too patient and too clever to be the work of an ordinary thief. Someone close to him, someone trusted, was siphoning his fortune with the deliberate care of a man who intended never to be caught. And the Duke of Ashmere, who could outmaneuver half the king's council in his sleep, could not find him, because the betrayal lived inside his own walls, and he no longer knew which of his own people to believe. And why, Lyra asked, when she had absorbed all of it, would you tell this to me? A woman you met 3 days ago, a woman who struck you in public. He looked at her with that steady, reading gaze. Because you saw the man with the knife, he said, when 200 people did not. Because you mistrusted me on excellent evidence and said so to my face. He paused. And because everyone I currently employ has a reason to lie to me, and you have none. I am, he added, with the faint dryness she would come to recognize as the whole of his humor, in the unusual position of finding your contempt more trustworthy than my staff's loyalty. Lyra was quiet for a moment. The winter light came flat and silver through the window. She thought about the coal merchant's bill on her desk, and the leaking roof, and the careful arithmetic by which she kept herself afloat, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she did not want his money, or his protection, or any of the things a poor woman was supposed to want from a rich man. She wanted, absurdly, to find out who was robbing him. What are you offering? She asked. A position, he said, discreet, generous. You would come to Ashmere House as a cataloguer of the late Duchess's correspondence and library, which genuinely requires doing and explains your presence to my household. In truth, you would be observing the people I cannot afford to watch myself, because they would watch me watching them. He held her gaze. I am asking you to be invisible in a house full of people who are very good at being seen. Lyra Venmore, who had spent 2 years perfecting the art of disappearing in plain sight, looked at the man across the table and felt something she had not felt in longer than she cared to measure, which was interest. I will need a week to settle my affairs, she said. He inclined his head. Take it, he said. And Lady Venmore. She looked up. Thank you, he said, for the slap. It was the first honest thing anyone has done in my presence in some time. The week became a month, and the month became the strangest and most alive stretch of Lyra's recent life. She arrived at Ashmere House with a single trunk and the cover of her cataloguing work, and she discovered within 3 days that the work was not entirely a cover, because the late Duchess, Adrian's mother, had been a woman of formidable intellect and 10,000 volumes, and her correspondence was a genuine treasure that had sat unattended since her death. Lyra found herself, in the hours when she was not quietly watching the household, actually absorbed in the dead woman's letters, in the warmth and wit of a person Adrian had clearly loved, and she began to understand the man a little through the mother who had laughed in a house that had since grown so quiet. The household revealed itself slowly, the way households did to someone patient enough to be furniture. There was Pelham, the steward, lean and grey, and so efficient he seemed mechanical, who had served the dukedom for 11 years. There was the secretary, Harrogate, younger and warmer, who remembered every name and birthday with a thoroughness that struck Lyra as a touch too practiced. There was the housekeeper, Mrs. Dane, who assessed Lyra in approximately 2 seconds upon arrival, and arrived, Lyra sensed, at a cautiously favourable verdict, and who alone in that house seemed to wish its master something like happiness. And there was Adrian, who came to the library every morning. He did not have to. She understood this. He came to retrieve a volume he could have sent a footman for, or to review correspondence he could have read in his study. And he sat at one of the long tables in the cold morning light and read while she worked, and they did not speak for the first 3 days, and on the fourth he said, without looking up, "You have reorganized the eastern shelves." "They were arranged by the year my mother acquired them," she said, "which is sentimental and useless to anyone who wants to find a book. I am arranging them by subject." He was quiet a moment. "My mother arranged them that way," he said. "I know," Lyra said. "I read the letter where she said she found the conventional method tyrannical and the acquisition method affectionate. She was wrong, but she was charming about it." And there it was again, that movement at the corner of his mouth, almost a smile, gone before it finished. "Continue," he said, and returned to his reading, and stayed 40 minutes longer than the volume he had retrieved could possibly have required. She found she had been holding her breath for the last 10 of them. She made a note that evening in the private journal where she recorded her observations of the household, and after the column of names and movements and small suspicions, she wrote a line she immediately wished she had not. "Employer does not smile. Suspect he has forgotten how. Proceed carefully." She underlined the last word, and then, because underlining felt like a confession, she struck it out. The first thread came loose on a Thursday, which she would later think of as significant, because Thursdays had begun to carry a weight in her mind. Being the day Adrian had no morning counsel and lingered longest in the library, and the day they had fallen into the habit of taking tea together at the small table, while she reported what she had seen, and he listened with that complete reading attention that felt less like being judged than being understood. She had been comparing the Duchess's old household ledgers against the current accounts, ostensibly for her cataloguing, in truth for the pattern, and she found a discrepancy, not in the numbers themselves, but in the handwriting. A contract for timber from the northern estate signed in Adrian's name, witnessed by Pelham, dated to a week when, by his own account given idly over tea 2 days before, Adrian had been at the King's Council in the south and could not have signed anything in the north. She brought it to him that evening when the house had gone quiet, the contract in her hand, and he read it once, then again, and she watched the thing happen in his face that she was learning to read. The slight tightening at the eyes, the controlled exhale, the way his stillness deepened until the temperature of the room seemed to drop. "Pelham witnessed this," he said. 11 years, Lyra said gently, because she could see what it cost him. "My father trusted him," Adrian said. His voice was very quiet. "I trusted him." She understood then what this was. Not the theft, though the theft was considerable, but the particular wound of discovering that certainty had been misplaced, that the architecture of his trust had a rotten beam in it he had not seen. "You could not have known," she said. "I should have," he said. And then, after a silence she did not fill, because she had learned his silences were where he actually thought, he said, "You found in a month what I could not find in a year. Why?" The question was genuine. He was asking why a woman with no stake in his fortune would have looked so hard. She thought about it honestly, because she always answered honestly, a habit she had never managed to break even when convenient lies would have served her better. "Because no one was watching me," she said, "so I could watch everything." And because she paused, surprised by the truth as it arrived, because, somewhere in the last month, I stopped doing this for the position and started doing it for you, which I had not intended, and would prefer you not make a great deal of. He looked at her across the table in the lamplight, those winter eyes steady and for once not entirely guarded, and the silence that followed was different from the silences before it, fuller, warmer, dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with stewards or stolen timber. "Then we will say nothing of it," he said at last, and his voice was not quite steady, and they both pretended that it was. But Pelham was not the architect. He was a beam, not the builder, and as Lyra pulled the thread further over the following days, she found the structure was larger and more patient than a single corrupt steward, that the contracts ran outward toward a name that meant nothing to her, and a great deal to Adrian, a man named Lord Garrick Vane, a cousin of the late Duchess, and, in the absence of a living brother or any child of Adrian's, the heir presumptive to the entire dukedom. Vane had spent years, it became clear, building toward a single patient outcome, not robbery for its own sake, but the slow construction of a case, financial irregularities he could later present as evidence of a duke unfit to manage his own affairs, a man whose estates bled because his judgment had failed, the sort of accusation that, brought before the right council with the right documents, could see a dukedom placed under the management of its heir, while its holder was quietly set aside. And then, the day after Lyra understood the full shape of it, the forgery came, and it was aimed not at Adrian, but at her. A letter was produced, in handwriting studied close enough to hers to deceive anyone without a true sample to compare, addressed to Lord Garrick Vane, detailing the exact intelligence she had gathered in Ashmere House, the discrepancies, the steward, the structure, offered, the letter implied, in exchange for a sum and a position once the dukedom changed hands. It suggested that Lyra Venmore, drowning in her father's debts, had been Vane's instrument from the beginning, placed in the household to feed her true master the very information she pretended to uncover. It was very good. The knowledge in it was real, which meant whoever had built it had access to her observations, and it was already circulating, having reached, by the time Adrian held it in his hands, 2 members of the council and a quantity of fashionable drawing rooms that meant the season would have it by week's end. He came to the library where she waited. She had heard about it before he arrived, because Mrs. Dane had warned her, kindly and quickly, and she stood now by the cold hearth with her composure held together by both hands. He stood in the doorway with the letter, and she watched his face, and she saw the worst thing she could have seen, which was not anger but uncertainty, the old wound stirring, the part of him that had loved a woman 3 years ago and learned that love could be a thing arranged against him. "I did not write it," she said. "The handwriting is close," she said before he could speak. "Look at the capital V. I closed the loop to the left. This one closes right. Whoever studied my hand worked from a limited sample. Adrian, look at me and tell me you doubt it, because if you do, I will leave this house tonight, and you will never have to wonder again." He looked at the letter, he looked at her, and she watched him stand, for one terrible suspended moment, exactly where he had stood 3 years ago, with a different woman and a different betrayal, and she understood that whatever he decided now, he was not really deciding about her at all, but about whether he could ever again trust the thing his own heart told him. "I don't believe you wrote it," he said. The relief came so fast and so complete it nearly took her composure with it, and she held it together through sheer practice, the way she had held everything together for 2 years. "But you hesitated," she said quietly, because she would not pretend she had not seen it. "Yes," he admitted, and it was the bravest thing she had yet seen him do, the bare, unguarded admission. "Not because of you. Because of a thing that happened to me before you, that I have let make decisions it has no right to make." He set the letter down. "I will not let it make this one. I am asking you to stay, and I am asking you to forgive me the half a second in which I was a coward." She crossed the room. She had not decided to. Her feet simply carried her, and she stopped before him close enough to see the strain at the corners of his eyes, and she said, "We will deal with Vane together. But you will have to learn to trust the thing your own judgment tells you, Adrian, because it will choose the wrong moment to fail you again. And when it does, I need to know you will tell me, rather than go quiet and send me away." "Yes," he said, "I know. I'm sorry." And then, because she could not help it, because the relief and the fear and the month of small accumulating moments had worn through her discipline at last, she said, "You poured the tea yourself. The first morning. Dukes do not pour tea." He looked at her, the ghost of the almost smile rising at last towards something complete. "I am aware," he said, "of what dukes generally do. I have never found it sufficient." She did not stay long in the room after that. She had learned, somewhere in a hard life, that it was always better to leave a charged moment first, that it cost nothing and gave nothing away. But she carried it with her, up the cold stairs, and lay awake a long time, and for the first time the not sleeping was not entirely unpleasant. The next days, he moved against Vane with a competence that confirmed everything London feared about him, and concealed everything that was true. He did not confront, he gathered. He set two men he had tested and proven over years to trace the forgery and the contracts from opposite directions at once, and he confronted Pelham quietly and found, as Lyra had begun to suspect, a man more relieved than defiant, a man Vane had compromised years ago through a debt of his own, and who had been carrying the weight of it like a stone. He was glad at last to set down. Pelham gave them everything, the chain of intermediaries, the dates, the structure. In exchange for a mercy Adrian extended without hesitation, and Lyra understood watching it that the Duke of Ashmere's reputation for coldness had been built entirely by men who had never seen what he did with someone who told him the truth. The forgery, traced, collapsed. Vane had been too clever, and cleverness leaves a longer trail than honesty. And within the fortnight, Adrian held documented proof of every contract, every stolen sum, every intermediary between Lord Garrick Vane and the slow, patient theft of a dukedom, and the matter passed, as such matters did, not into violence, but into the cold machinery of the council and the law, where Vane's resources could not outrun the simple weight of evidence honestly assembled. He would keep his title, the lesser one that was his by birth. He would lose everything else that mattered, the access, the influence, the careful web of obligation he had spent years weaving, and he would not be comfortable in London by the spring. But before that ended, on the evening, Adrian learned that the council would hear the case, and Vane could no longer touch either of them. The rain came down hard over the city, the relentless winter rain that turns the streets to silver, and Lyra was in the library when she heard the carriage in the drive, fast and direct to the front rather than the servant's approach, which meant he had not waited for it to stop raining. He came in soaked through, his dark hair flat with it, his coat saturated, the careful composure of him undone by weather and what she suspected had been a very hard drive. And he found her by the cold hearth and said, without preamble, "It's finished. Vane cannot touch you. The forgery is publicly discredited. Your name is your own again. You could have sent a note," she said. "Yes," he said. "Then why didn't you?" He stood there dripping on the library floor, and she watched him reach for the vocabulary of a thing he had spent a decade not saying, and fail at it, and try again. "Because I sat in my study for 2 hours after it was done," he said, "doing every practical thing there was to do, and I could not determine why the practical resolution was insufficient. The practical resolution is always sufficient." He stopped. "That was unfamiliar to me. I drove because waiting another hour to tell you was a thing I found I could not do, and I do not have a better explanation than that." Lyra crossed the wet floor and put her hand flat against his soaked chest, over the rain-cold fabric, and felt his heart going faster than his composure allowed. "That," she said, "is a very composed way of saying you missed me." Something broke open in his face, the long-held thing finally giving way like ice in an early thaw, not shattering but releasing. "Yes," he said softly, "that is what it was." They were married in the spring, in the small chapel on the Ashmere grounds that had not been used for anything but formality in 30 years, opened now and lit with morning light through tall windows, smelling of old stone and beeswax and the white winter roses Lyra had asked for specifically because they were the first thing she had seen in his house that told her a person lived there rather than merely a duke. There was no arrangement in it, no debt repaid, no fortune rescuing fortune. She had insisted on that, and he had agreed without hesitation, and her own surviving debts he had cleared not as a husband's right, but as a business arrangement with her northern estate that left her father's name whole and her own dignity intact, which she had understood, when he explained it, as the most romantic thing anyone had ever done for her, and had told him so, and he had said it was simply efficient, and she had let him believe she believed that. The witnesses were Mrs. Dane, who wept without apology, and Pelham, pardoned and pale and steadier than he had been in years, and a formidable elderly aunt of Adrian's who had been telling him for a decade to do something about his life, and now sat in the front pew with the expression of a woman who intended to take full credit. Lyra wore ivory of her own choosing, and when she appeared in the chapel doorway, Adrian looked at her with the truest of his expressions. the one beneath the composure and the authority, and the winter-eyed certainty, wonder, unguarded and complete, and the whole assembled household had to look briefly elsewhere. She walked to him without haste. She had learned, that hard year, that arriving was worth the whole of the journey. He took her hands. "Ready?" she asked, echoing nothing in particular, only the small private language they had built. "I have been," he said, "since you struck me in the dark for excellent reasons and refused to apologize." She smiled. "You could have walked away," she said. "I could have," he agreed. "I was never going to." Years later, when the house at Ashmere had filled again with the noise his mother's letters remembered, and there were children with their father's winter eyes, and their mother's refusal to be managed, and the story of how the Duchess had slapped the Duke at a masquerade had become the kind of legend told at dinner tables to delighted and disbelieving grandchildren, Lyra would sit in the library where it had begun and look at the man she had chosen and know that the bravest thing she had ever done was not the slap, though the slap had its merits, but the choosing, clear-eyed and unafraid, of a man who expressed love in stolen-back fortunes, and notes that let her sleep and tea poured by hands that dukes did not use for tea. If this story stayed with you, if you held your breath in that ballroom, or felt something shift in the rain on a library floor, then it did what it was made to do. Love that is worth having is rarely arranged and never demanded. It is mistrusted, tested, fought for, and then chosen on purpose with both eyes open. The bravest thing is not surrendering, and it is not refusing, it is deciding. So if Lyra and Adrian found their way into your heart, leave a comment telling us the moment that stayed with you. Was it the slap, the roses, the forgery, or the rain? Share this with someone who loves a story about second chances and quiet courage, and subscribe, because every week here at the Duke Royal Tales, there is another story waiting, another guarded heart, another woman who refuses to disappear. We'll see you in the next.